A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century, by Barbara W. Tuchman. Introduction. Imagine for a moment, you're standing on a dock in Sicily in the year 1347. It's a busy port, full of the sounds and smells of trade. But today, something is wrong. A fleet of trading ships limps into the harbor, sails slack, an eerie silence hanging over them. As they draw closer, a horrifying sight comes into view. The men at the oars are dead or dying. Their bodies are covered in strange, black swellings, oozing blood and pus. They are sailors from the east, and they have brought with them a passenger more terrible than any invading army. They have brought the end of the world. That terrifying scene was Europe's first encounter with the Black Death, a plague that would kill an estimated one-third of the population from India to Iceland. It was a disaster of such magnitude that it's hard for us to even comprehend. But what if I told you that this single event was only one note in a symphony of chaos? What if I told you that the 14th century was a period of such violence, turmoil, and collapse that it makes our own turbulent times look almost peaceful? This is the promise of the book we're exploring today, A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century by the brilliant historian Barbara W. Tuchman. This isn't just a history book. It's a masterpiece of storytelling that won the Pulitzer Prize and has captivated millions of readers since it was first published. Tuchman had a simple but profound question. What happens to society when it's struck by the most lethal disaster in recorded history? Her search for an answer led her into the heart of a century racked by not just one, but 7 great scourges: plague, war, crushing taxes, brigandage, bad government, insurrection, and a catastrophic split in the church. By the end of our journey today, you won't just know what happened in this calamitous century. You will understand why it is a distant mirror to our own time. You'll see how societies fracture under pressure, how institutions we believe are permanent can crumble, and how, in the midst of it all, human beings, with all their folly, courage, and greed, endure. Tuchman gives us a guide through this dark world. A French nobleman named Enguerrand de Coucy, whose life from birth to death spans the century's greatest trials. Through his eyes, we will witness the collapse of an age. So, let's step back 600 years, into a world that is both shockingly alien and hauntingly familiar. Book summary. To understand the chaos of the 14th century, you first have to understand the world it was leaving behind. It was a world built on a seemingly unshakable order, a pyramid of society with God at the top. Below him were 3 distinct groups, or estates. The first was the clergy, those who prayed for the souls of all. The third was the commoner, the vast majority who toiled on the land or in the town so that everyone might eat. And in the middle, holding it all together, was the second estate, the nobility, the knights, whose sacred duty was to fight and protect the other two. This was the age of chivalry, an ideal of honor, valor, and Christian duty that governed the entire noble class. At the heart of this world stood France, considered the pinnacle of chivalry, learning, and faith. Her king was called the most Christian king. Her knights were the most admired in the world, and her University of Paris was the intellectual capital of Europe. And nowhere was the power and pride of this noble class more visible than in the great baronies of the realm. Imagine a colossal fortress perched on a hilltop in northern France, a guardian and sometimes a challenger to the king himself. This was the castle of Coucy, home to a dynasty so proud, so ambitious, and often so ferocious that their family motto declared their independence from all others. I am not king, nor prince, nor duke, nor count. I am the Lord of Coucy. The castle itself was a statement of power. Its central tower, the donjon, was the largest in Europe, 180 feet high, with walls 30 feet thick, capable of housing 1,000 men in a siege. It was a product of the same creative explosion that built the great cathedrals of France, and it was the home of Enguerrand de Coucy VII, the man who will be our guide through this story. His life, from his birth in 1340 to his death in 1397, coincided perfectly with the century's deepest crises. But the world he was born into, this seemingly stable world of knights and castles, was already trembling. A chill had settled over the land at the start of the century. The Baltic Sea froze over twice. Unseasonable cold, storms, and floods led to crop failures and a devastating famine from 1315 to 1317. A famine so severe that stories circulated of people eating their own children and the poor feeding on hanged bodies taken from the gallows. The very foundations of society were cracking. The Church, the great unifying force of the age, was in crisis. In a shocking display of the growing power of kings, the King of France had sent his agents to assault the Pope himself, Boniface VIII. The Pope died from the shock of the outrage, and not long after, the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon in southern France. For the next 70 years, the popes would be French, living in what many called a Babylonian exile. This Avignon papacy became a symbol of the Church's worldliness. The popes, successors to the poor fishermen of Galilee, now lived like kings in a massive palace fortress, surrounded by luxury. To finance their lavish courts, they turned the machinery of the Church into a vast enterprise for generating revenue. Everything was for sale: church offices, pardons for sins, dispensations from rules. If you wanted to marry your cousin, there was a fee. If you wanted your illegitimate child legitimized, there was a fee. The selling of salvation became big business. This corruption seeped down through every level. Bishops who bought their positions passed the cost down to the local priests. And on the street level, the common people met the Church in the form of the pardoner, a character immortalized by Chaucer, who would sell absolution for any sin from gluttony to homicide, peddling counterfeit salvation to a credulous and fearful public. The knights, too, were failing in their sacred duty. The ideal of chivalry was to protect the weak, uphold justice, and defend the faith. But in practice, the warrior class had become the oppressors. Their private wars laid waste to the countryside. Their incessant need for money led them to squeeze their peasants dry, and their function in a world of growing royal power was becoming less about protection and more about performance. They poured their energy into tournaments, magnificent and violent spectacles that were more about personal glory and financial gain than actual military training. The gap between the ideal of chivalry and the reality of the knight's behavior had grown into a chasm. This was the fraying world into which Enguerrand de Coucy was born. It was a world of deep contradictions, a church that preached poverty but wallowed in wealth, a knighthood sworn to protect the weak that preyed upon them instead. And into this world, two great calamities were about to strike, one man-made, the other born of nature. The first was the 100 Years' War. It began, as so many conflicts do, over land and a claim to a crown. The King of England, Edward III, held a large part of southwestern France called Aquitaine, but he held it as a vassal to the French king. This was an intolerable situation for both sides. The French kings wanted their land back. The English kings wanted full sovereignty. In 1337, war finally broke out, and Edward revived an old claim to the French throne itself through his mother, a French princess. At first, the contest seemed laughably one-sided. France was the dominant power of Europe, with 5 times England's population and a reputation for military glory that was second to none. But England had a secret weapon, a revolutionary piece of technology that would change the face of warfare: the longbow. The longbow was a simple but deadly weapon, 6 feet long, made of yew. It could fire arrows with terrifying speed and accuracy. A skilled longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute, compared to a crossbowman's 2. At 200 yards, its iron-tipped arrows could pierce armor. The French knights, encased in their heavy plate armor and bound by a code that prized the individual charge above all else, despised missile weapons. War, to them, was a matter of personal combat, of valor tested face to face. They viewed archers as cowards who dared not fight up close. It was a fatal miscalculation. The first great test came at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. King Edward's army, having plundered its way through Normandy, was cornered by a much larger French force. The English took up a defensive position on a hillside, with their knights dismounted and their longbowmen arranged in deadly formations on the flanks. What followed was a catastrophe born of French arrogance. The French knights, eager for glory, refused to wait for their own crossbowmen to soften the English lines. They charged uphill, in chaotic waves, right into a storm of English arrows. The bowstring sang, and thousands of arrows rained down, darkening the sky. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders. Knights in heavy armor, unable to rise from the mud, were slaughtered on the ground by Welshmen with long knives. The flower of French chivalry was cut down. It was a devastating blow, not just to an army, but to an entire social order. The idea that a peasant with a long bow could defeat a nobleman on his warhorse was unthinkable, and it shook the very foundations of the medieval world. Enguerrand de Coucy's own father was killed around this time, making the 7-year-old boy the new Lord of Coucy. But a disaster far greater than Crécy was already on its way. In October 1347, those Genoese ships arrived in Sicily. The Black Death had reached Europe. It spread with terrifying speed, carried by the fleas on black rats that traveled in the holds of merchant ships. By January 1348, it was in France. It moved along the coasts and up the rivers, reaching Paris by the summer. The disease came in two forms. The first, bubonic, caused the telltale black swellings, or buboes, in the armpits and groin. It was spread by contact and killed its victims within 5 days. The second form, pneumonic, infected the lungs and was even more virulent. It was spread by breath, and it could kill in 3 days or less, sometimes in just 24 hours. There was no known prevention and no cure. The fabric of society disintegrated. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, wrote one chronicler. Doctors refused to see the sick, priests would not administer last rites. People died alone, and their bodies were left in the streets. In the cities, where the plague hit hardest, mass burial pits were dug, and corpses were piled up in layers like lasagna. In Avignon, the Pope consecrated the Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into it. People said and believed, "This is the end of the world." The death toll was staggering. Modern demographers estimate that in the space of about 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, a third of Europe's population perished. That would be about 20 million people. In some places, the toll was much higher. Florence lost up to 4/5 of its citizens. Entire villages were wiped out, their fields returning to wilderness. No one understood the cause. They blamed it on a malign conjunction of the planets, on earthquakes releasing poisonous fumes from the Earth's core, or, most commonly, on the wrath of God. If the plague was a divine punishment, then there must be a human agent to blame. The scapegoat was found, as so often in history, in the Jews. Wild accusations spread that the Jews were poisoning the wells in a conspiracy to destroy Christendom. A wave of horrific persecutions followed. From Spain to Germany, Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive. In Strasbourg, before the plague had even reached the city, 2,000 Jews were taken to the cemetery and massacred. The Pope issued bulls declaring the Jews innocent and pointing out that they were dying of the plague just like Christians, but his voice was lost in the hysteria. The plague also gave rise to the flagellants, groups of penitents who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with iron-spiked scourges until they bled. They believed that by reenacting the suffering of Christ on their own bodies, they could atone for mankind's sins and turn away God's wrath. At first revered, they soon grew arrogant, claiming to be able to forgive sins themselves, and they became a revolutionary, anti-clerical force, inciting attacks on both priests and Jews before the movement was finally suppressed. Enguerrand de Coucy, now an orphan after his mother died in a later outbreak, was 9 years old when the first wave passed. He grew up in a world hollowed out by death, a world of shrunken populations and haunted landscapes. The Black Death had turned the social pyramid upside down. With labor suddenly scarce, the value of land plummeted and the price of labor soared. Peasants and artisans found themselves in a position of new power. They demanded higher wages and refused to perform their old feudal duties. The landowners, the nobility, were in crisis. They tried to hold down wages by law, like the Statute of Laborers in England, but the economic tide was against them. The old bonds of feudalism were breaking. And the war with France went on. In 1356, 10 years after Crécy, the two sides met again at Poitiers. This time, the French were led by their king, Jean II, a man who, in his rashness and military incompetence, seemed to have learned nothing from the earlier disaster. The French again had a vast numerical superiority. The English, led by Edward's son, the Black Prince, were cornered, exhausted, and burdened with plunder from a long raid. The Black Prince was so certain of defeat that he offered to give up all his prisoners and conquests and agree not to fight against France for 7 years. But King Jean, arrogant in his strength, demanded that the prince and 100 of his knights surrender themselves as prisoners. The prince refused, and the battle was joined. The French repeated the mistakes of Crécy with an almost suicidal perfection. Their initial cavalry charge was shattered by the English longbowmen. Then, in a bizarre tactical decision, the main body of French knights dismounted to attack on foot. Encumbered by their heavy armor, they advanced slowly across the field. Their formations broke apart, their leaders were killed or captured, and one entire battalion, commanded by the king's brother, fled the field without striking a blow. King Jean himself fought with incredible bravery, his youngest son, a boy of 14, at his side. But he was surrounded, his helmet knocked off, bleeding from wounds to his face. "Yield, or you are a dead man," cried the voices around him. And so, the King of France was captured on the field of battle. The defeat at Poitiers was even more devastating than Crécy. It was a national humiliation. It wasn't just a king that was lost, but the very prestige of the French nobility. They had failed again in their one essential function, to fight and protect the realm. When the nobles returned to their estates to raise money for their own ransoms, the common people greeted them with scorn and hatred. The cry of "traitor" was heard in the land. How else could the great host of French chivalry be defeated by a handful of archers and brigands except by betrayal? France was now a kingdom without a king, defeated, leaderless, and descending into chaos. The Dauphin, the young heir to the throne, was a sickly and inexperienced teenager. The treasury was empty. And into this vacuum of power stepped the merchants and leaders of Paris, led by a man named Etienne Marcel. They saw their chance to seize control from a discredited monarchy and impose a new order. They demanded reforms, the dismissal of corrupt royal councillors, and a share of power for the Third Estate. For a time, they succeeded. The Dauphin was forced to accept their demands. But Marcel, in his struggle with the crown, allied himself with a dangerous and unstable figure, Charles of Navarre, a rival claimant to the throne known as Charles the Bad. And he made an even more fatal choice. He supported the most terrifying uprising of the century, the Jacquerie. In May of 1358, the pent-up rage of the French peasantry finally exploded. For centuries, they had been the bent atlas of the medieval world, supporting the other two estates on their backs, scorned by the nobles, exploited by all. Now, pushed to the brink by the ravages of war, by the brigandage of unemployed soldiers called the Free Companies, and by the crushing taxes demanded by the lords for their ransoms, they rose up. It began in a village near Paris, when a group of peasants, after a meeting in the cemetery, declared that the nobles had shamed and despoiled the realm and that it would be a good thing to destroy them all. They rushed the nearest manor, killed the knight and his family, and burned it to the ground. The fire spread. Within weeks, thousands of peasants, armed with pitchforks and scythes, were on a rampage, attacking castles, murdering lords, and committing unspeakable atrocities. A wave of terror swept through the noble class. They saw the Jacques not just as rebels, but as a force bent on the annihilation of their entire order. Guillaume Caille, a charismatic peasant with military experience, emerged as their leader. He tried to forge an alliance with the towns, and for a moment, it seemed a true revolution of the non-nobles against the nobles might succeed. But the Jacquerie was too brutal, too chaotic. Etienne Marcel's support for them cost him the backing of the propertied classes in Paris. The turning point came at Meaux, where a band of Jacques besieged a fortress holding several hundred noble ladies. They were rescued by a party of knights who slaughtered the peasants like beasts. After that, the suppression was merciless. Charles of Navarre, seeing which way the wind was blowing, led the nobles' counterattack. Guillaume Caille was captured by treachery and executed. And the young Enguerrand de Coucy, now 18, made his first mark on history. He gathered a force of gentlemen and hunted down the remaining Jacques without pity or mercy, completing their extermination. The Jacquerie was crushed within a month. In Paris, Étienne Marcel, isolated and increasingly radical, was assassinated by his own citizens, who then opened the gates to the Dauphin. The bourgeois revolution was over. But France was still a broken country. The king was a captive in England. The free companies roamed the land, a plague of bandits that the government was powerless to stop. And the Church, which should have been a source of comfort, was about to inflict upon Christendom its deepest wound of all. The Papal Schism. In 1377, after 70 years in Avignon, Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papacy to Rome, much to the dismay of his French cardinals, who had grown accustomed to the luxuries and political safety of their French home. When Gregory died the following year, the people of Rome, terrified that another French pope would be elected and take the papacy back to Avignon, surrounded the Vatican, howling, "We want a Roman, a Roman." In fear for their lives, the cardinals elected an Italian, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. He was a man known for his humility and competence. But the moment the papal crown was on his head, he transformed into an arrogant, abusive, and possibly insane tyrant. He insulted the cardinals, threatened them, and tried to strip them of their wealth and privileges. The French cardinals were horrified. They had elected a master who had turned into a monster. They fled from Rome and declared that the election of Urban was invalid because it had been made under duress. And then, in September 1378, they elected one of their own as Pope, Robert of Geneva, a man known throughout Italy as the Butcher of Cesena for his role in a horrific massacre. He took the name Clement VII. And so there were two popes. The Great Schism of the West had begun, and it would tear Christendom apart for 40 years. Every nation in Europe had to choose a side. France, naturally, supported the French Pope in Avignon. England, just as naturally, sided with the Italian Pope in Rome, because he was the enemy of France's Pope. The conflict divided kingdoms, universities, and even religious orders. Each pope excommunicated the other and all his followers. Every Christian in Europe was now, in the eyes of one pope or the other, a heretic, living under threat of damnation. The schism was a spiritual catastrophe, and it completed the century's work of destruction. It seemed that every institution that gave meaning and order to life had failed. The nobility had failed to protect the people. The monarchy had failed to govern. And now the Church, the very house of God, was a house divided, ruled by two grasping and hostile rivals. In the midst of this decay, Enguerrand de Coucy navigated a difficult path. He had married Isabella, the eldest daughter of King Edward III of England, a match that made him a son-in-law to his own country's enemy. For years, he maintained a precarious double allegiance, refusing to fight for either side. But as the war reignited, he was forced to choose. He renounced his English titles and lands, sent his wife back to England, and declared himself a good and true Frenchman. He became one of the most trusted and capable figures at the French court, a skilled diplomat and an experienced commander. He fought campaigns in Italy, led an army of mercenaries into Switzerland, and in 1390, commanded a crusade against the Barbary pirates in North Africa. The world he moved in was one of extravagant, almost hysterical splendor, as if the ruling class were trying to cover the decay of their society with a gilded shroud. It was an age of fantastic fashions, of pointed shoes so long they had to be tied to the knee, of magnificent tournaments and banquets where pies were served with live birds inside. But beneath the glitter, the shadows were lengthening. The King of France, Charles VI, the boy who had succeeded his wise father, was prone to fits of madness. His first attack came in 1392, when, on a hot summer day, he suddenly drew his sword and, crying treason, charged his own men, killing several before he was subdued. For the rest of his long reign, he would slip in and out of sanity, leaving the kingdom a playground for the ambitions of his greedy and warring relatives. It seemed as if the century was doomed to end in darkness. The plagues returned. The wars dragged on. The schism festered. A deep pessimism settled over Europe. It found its ultimate expression in the danse macabre, the dance of death, a new and morbid art form that appeared at this time. In murals painted on cemetery walls, a skeletal figure of death leads a procession of mortals from every rank of life: pope, emperor, knight, peasant, child, all dancing toward a common grave. The message was clear: power, honor, riches are nothing. In the end, death levels all. And it was to death that the last great enterprise of the century was dedicated: the final crusade. By the 1390s, the Ottoman Turks, who had crossed into Europe 50 years earlier, had conquered most of the Balkans and were now at the borders of Hungary. Their advance threatened the heart of Christendom. A call went out for a great crusade to drive them back. The response from France was overwhelming. Knighthood, idle since the latest truce with England, was eager for a new adventure, a new chance to win honor and glory. The Duke of Burgundy sponsored the expedition, putting his 24-year-old son, Jean de Nevers, in nominal command. But the real leadership, the chief counselor to whom everyone looked for experience and wisdom, was Enguerrand de Coucy. In 1396, the army of Crusaders, a glittering host of French chivalry, set out. Their numbers were augmented by Hungarians, Germans, and Knights Hospitallers. Their plan was audacious. After driving the Turks from the Balkans, they would march on to Constantinople, cross into Asia, and liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Their confidence was absolute, their arrogance boundless. They believed themselves invincible. They ignored the cautious advice of their Hungarian allies to wait for the Turks to come to them. Instead, they plunged deep into enemy territory, laying siege to the Turkish fortress of Nicopolis on the Danube. There, in September 1396, the Sultan Bajazet, known as the Thunderbolt for the speed of his movements, fell upon them. The French insisted on leading the charge, brushing aside the Hungarian king's sound tactical plan. "We are the vanguard," cried the Constable of France. "To take up the rear is to dishonor us." Believing they faced only the Turkish advance guard, they charged uphill, in their heavy armor, into a trap. They broke through the first line of untrained Turkish conscripts, then through a line of infantry protected by sharpened stakes. Exhausted, they reached the crest of the hill, expecting to find the remnants of a defeated army. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the elite of the Turkish cavalry, the Sipahis, fresh and waiting. The battle was a slaughter. The French were surrounded and cut down. "The lion in them turned to timid hare," wrote one chronicler. Admiral de Vienne, the eldest knight, was killed trying to rally them. The banner of Our Lady still clutched in his hand. Coucy fought with immense strength, but it was hopeless. The Crusaders were overwhelmed. The defeat was followed by a horrific sequel. Enraged by his own heavy losses, and by the discovery that the Crusaders had massacred their Turkish prisoners before the battle, Bajazet ordered a mass execution. The captured Crusaders, thousands of them, were stripped naked and marched before the Sultan. There, Jean de Nevers, Enguerrand de Coucy, and the other great lords, who had been set aside for ransom, were forced to stand and watch as their companions were beheaded, one by one, from morning until late afternoon. The crusade had ended in a catastrophe far worse than Crécy or Poitiers. It was the final, bloody testament to the failure of chivalry. Enguerrand de Coucy, the man who had survived all the century's other disasters, did not survive this one. He died in a Turkish prison in Brusa a few months later, in February 1397, before his ransom could be arranged. His heart was embalmed and sent back to France, a final, melancholy relic of a shattered age. His life had been a mirror of his time. He was born into the pride of chivalry and died in its ruin. He had witnessed the peak of the medieval world and its calamitous fall. His story, and the story of his century, is a profound and somber lesson in the cycles of history, in the fragility of order, and in the enduring, often tragic, nature of humankind. Commentary. When you close a book like a distant mirror, the first thing that strikes you is its weight. Not the physical weight, but the emotional and intellectual weight of having lived through such an age of relentless disaster. Barbara Tuchman's genius is not just in chronicling the events, but in making you feel the texture of the time, the anxiety, the superstition, the brief flashes of beauty and heroism in an ocean of darkness. She chose her title, A Distant Mirror, with incredible precision. The 14th century is not just a collection of historical facts, it is a reflection of our own anxieties. When we read about a society grappling with a mysterious and deadly pandemic, a society where the established institutions, the government, the church, are losing their authority and the trust of the people, it's impossible not to feel a shiver of recognition. One of the most powerful lessons from this book is about the illusion of permanence. The people of the 14th century believed their world was ordained by God, that its structures were eternal. The three estates, the universal church, the code of chivalry, these were not just traditions, they were the pillars of reality. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, they all began to crumble. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a whole way of thinking. It shattered the belief in a just and ordered universe under a benevolent God. It showed that the systems people relied on for protection and salvation could fail, utterly and catastrophically. This brings us to the second great lesson: the danger of a society that refuses to adapt. The French knights at Crécy, Poitiers, and Nicopolis are a perfect, tragic example. They were brave, there's no question about that. But their bravery was trapped inside a rigid code of honor that had become completely detached from reality. They clung to the glorious, individual cavalry charge in an age when the longbow had made it obsolete. They valued personal glory more than a coherent strategy. They refused to learn from their mistakes, and so they repeated them, again and again, with devastating consequences. Their story is a timeless warning against clinging to outdated ideas in the face of a changing world. But this isn't just a story of collapse. It's also a story of resilience. In the midst of the chaos, you see the first stirrings of a new world. You see it in the peasants demanding their freedom, in the merchants of Paris trying to create a constitutional government, in thinkers like Wycliffe challenging the authority of the church and calling for a religion that people could understand in their own language. These movements were almost all crushed in their own time, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into the Renaissance and the Reformation. The 14th century, in its agony, was giving birth to the modern world. So, what can we take from this journey into a dark and distant past? First, a sense of perspective. As turbulent as our own times may feel, humanity has weathered worse storms. We have faced collapse, and we have rebuilt. Second, a sense of caution. The story of the 14th century shows how quickly things can unravel when institutions lose their moral authority and when leaders indulge in folly and self-interest. It reminds us that the structures of our society are not as permanent as we might think. They require constant care, reform, and the courage to adapt. And finally, a sense of profound empathy for the people who lived through that time. They weren't just characters in a history book. They were real people who loved, and feared, and hoped, and suffered, just as we do. Their world was torn apart, but they endured. And in their story, in this distant mirror, we can, if we look closely, see a reflection of ourselves. That was a summary of A Distant Mirror by Barbara W. Tuchman. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but a summary, no matter how detailed, is only a map. The real treasure is in the journey itself. The magic of this book is in Tuchman's incredible prose, the way she makes you feel the mud of Agincourt or the terror in a plague-stricken city. This summary is here to show you what the book holds and help you decide if it's a journey you want to take. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that will change the way you see the past, and maybe, just maybe, the way you see the present. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey through history has given you a new perspective, I'd be grateful if you'd click that like button and subscribe to Billionaire's Bookshelf. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another book that has the power to shape the way we think. Let's keep discovering these timeless lessons together.